I was never the kind of person who believed in stories about things lurking in the woods. I grew up in a small town, spent plenty of time outside, and always figured most of those tales came from people who got spooked too easily. But what happened that night in the middle of nowhere, out at the cabin, I still can't explain. And I don't think I ever will. It happened a few years ago when I was 29. A friend of mine had a family cabin up in a remote part of Montana, a place his grandfather had built way back in the 50s. It wasn't a fancy getaway, just an old wooden structure deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, an old well, and a radio that barely picked up anything. It was the kind of place you went to if you wanted absolute silence. He used to invite people up there for hunting trips, but that year no one else could make it. Work schedules, family obligations, all that. I didn't mind. I liked the idea of getting away by myself for a few days, clearing my head. So I packed up my truck with enough food and supplies to last a week, grabbed my rifle just in case, and made the 6-hour drive up there. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was getting low. The last stretch was nothing but a dirt road, winding through thick forest with no signs, no houses, nothing. Just trees on both sides and the occasional deer darting across. I had been to the cabin once before, but never alone. The deeper I drove, the more I started to feel how isolated the place really was. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I shut off the engine and just sat there for a moment, taking it in. The place looked the same as before, small, weathered, with a sagging porch and an old metal roof. Behind it, the forest stretched for miles. There were no neighbors, no roads beyond this one. The air was completely still. No wind, no rustling leaves. Just quiet. I grabbed my things and went inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust. There was a single bed in the corner, a rickety table, and a fireplace filled with ashes from the last time someone had used it. I lit a few lanterns, got a fire going, and settled in for the night. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it hiking, exploring the area, making sure I remembered the landmarks so I wouldn't get turned around. There was a small stream about a mile from the cabin, and I figured I'd do some fishing later in the week. The weather was perfect, clear skies, crisp air. That night, I sat outside on the porch for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. I could hear crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. Normal stuff. But then, just as I was about to head inside, I heard something else. It was faint at first, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. A sound that didn't fit. Not an animal, not the wind. Sounded like a person. It was distant, too far to make out clearly, but I could swear it was a voice. A low, broken sound, like someone talking just on the edge of hearing. I stood there, listening. My first thought was that maybe someone was out there. Maybe a lost hiker or a hunter who had wandered too far. But who the hell would be out here, this deep in the woods, miles from anything, after dark? I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but the light barely reached past the first few rows of trunks. The sound had stopped. Everything was quiet again. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I locked up the cabin for the night, I made sure to set my rifle by the bed, just in case. The next day was normal. I went out to the stream, did some fishing, chopped some wood for the stove. But every so often, I'd catch myself looking toward the tree line, remembering that sound from the night before. That evening, as the sun went down, I built a fire outside. I figured maybe I'd stay up a little later, let myself relax. But as I was sitting there, I started getting this feeling, like I was being watched. I kept glancing around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but I didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Something felt off. Then, just as I was about to head inside, I heard it again, closer this time. A voice, but not quite right. Sounded wrong, like someone trying to speak but not knowing how. A low, uneven noise, like a throat not meant for words trying to form them. I froze, staring into the dark. Then the voice called out again, and this time I could make out words. But they were my words. It was mimicking me, my own voice, repeated back in a slow, distorted way. I felt my stomach drop. My breathing went shallow. My mind was screaming at me to get inside, to lock the door. I backed toward the cabin, rifle in hand, keeping my flashlight pointed toward the trees. And that's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, something moved, a shape just barely visible in the dark. It was standing there, just watching. I couldn't make out its face, but it was tall, its limbs too long, its body too thin. The way it stood wasn't right, like it didn't fully understand how to hold itself up. Then, in that same broken voice, it spoke again. "Hello," the exact way I had said it earlier. The same tone, the same hesitation. I didn't wait. I slammed the cabin door shut, bolted it, and killed the lanterns. The only light was the glow of the fire outside, flickering through the cracks in the wood. I sat there, rifle in my hands, barely breathing. For the next few hours, I heard it moving outside. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. Sometimes closer, sometimes further. And every so often, it would speak, repeating my own words back to me, mocking me. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, the sound stopped. The footsteps faded. The last thing I heard before dawn was a low, rasping breath right outside the wall. Then silence. When morning came, I packed my things and left. I didn't look back. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there, and whatever was watching me, it wasn't human. I've worked as a Forest Service officer for the past 6 years, patrolling the deep woods, responding to calls, and keeping an eye on remote cabins. Most of the time, it's quiet, just nature and a few hikers. But every now and then, something happens that sticks with you, something that makes you question how much control we really have over the wilderness. This happened 3 years ago during a long, rainy night shift. I was stationed at a remote outpost deep in the Oregon woods, a small cabin built decades ago for rangers monitoring the area. It was old but sturdy, sitting at the end of a narrow, muddy road, surrounded by thick pines. There were no other buildings for miles, just a fire tower about 4 miles up the ridge and a few scattered trails that barely anyone used this time of year. That night, the rain had been falling steady since sunset, heavy and unrelenting. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin. My shift was from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., long and boring, just keeping an eye on things, making sure no one was trespassing or doing anything illegal. The storm made everything feel even more isolated. The radio crackled once in a while with updates from dispatch, but other than that, it was just the rain, the wind, and the occasional creak of the old structure settling into the earth. Around 11 p.m., I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The rain had turned the ground into thick mud, making it hard to walk without slipping. My truck was parked a few feet away, its headlights off, its body coated in water and dirt. The air was cold, smelling of wet pine and damp earth. I stood under the overhang of the cabin's roof, watching the rain pour down in sheets. That's when I noticed something, a sound. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was distant, barely audible, but enough to catch my attention. A faint rustling, like something moving through the undergrowth. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But then it stopped, completely. No movement, just silence except for the storm. I stood still, listening. The woods were dark, the trees swaying in the wind, their branches bending under the weight of the rain. My flashlight was inside, but I didn't feel like moving. Something about that silence felt wrong. After a few minutes, I shook it off and went back inside. The old cabin was dimly lit by a single overhead light, its wooden interior giving off a faint, musty smell. There was a small table, a radio, a cot in the corner, and a stove that barely worked. It wasn't comfortable, but it was better than being out in the storm. I sat back down, listening to the rain hammering the roof. My eyes felt heavy, but I wasn't about to sleep. That's when the motion sensor alarm outside beeped once. Just once. I froze. The cabin had a simple security system, a few motion sensors around the perimeter. They were old and unreliable, sometimes going off when the wind was strong enough. But this wasn't a gust of wind. It was a single, short beep. That meant something had moved. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, my pulse picking up. I walked to the window and shined the light outside. The rain made it hard to see, but nothing looked out of place. The truck was still there. The trees swayed. The mud glistened under the beam of light. I turned to check the monitor for the sensors. The system was outdated, just a simple screen with a few indicators. The one near the tree line had been triggered. That was about 20 feet from the cabin. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a bear wandering through, but I still grabbed my sidearm and slipped on my rain jacket. I wasn't about to take any chances. Stepping outside, the cold rain immediately soaked through my clothes. My boots sank into the mud as I moved toward the edge of the tree line, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the dripping leaves and wet ground. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Human footprints. Barefoot. They led from the trees toward the cabin, stopping just short of the motion sensor. Then they turned around, heading back into the woods. The rain had already started to wash them away, but they were clear enough. Someone had been here. I scanned the trees, my breath coming in sharp bursts. The forest was thick, the undergrowth dense and shadowed. I listened, but the only sound was the storm. I backed up slowly, keeping my light on the trees. My gut told me I wasn't alone out here. Someone was watching. I made it back inside and locked the door. My hands were damp, my fingers stiff from the cold. I radioed dispatch, letting them know I'd found tracks. They acknowledged, said they'd send someone in the morning to check it out. That didn't help me much. For the next few hours, I sat there, staring at the monitors, listening. The wind howled, the rain slammed against the windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Around 3 a.m., the motion sensor went off again. This time, 2 beeps. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my rifle, turned off the lights, and moved to the window. I aimed my flashlight at the spot where the footprints had been. Nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, just at the edge of the trees. It was tall, thin, barely visible in the rain. The moment my light hit it, it moved, fast, disappearing into the darkness. My heart pounded. I radioed again, telling dispatch what I saw. They said they'd send backup first thing in the morning. I was on my own until then. The rest of the night, I sat with my rifle in my lap, waiting. The sensors didn't go off again, but I knew whoever it was hadn't gone far. At dawn, the rain finally let up. A truck from the station arrived around 7 a.m. 2 officers stepped out, their faces tired but alert. I led them to the tree line, but the rain had done its job. Most of the tracks were gone. We searched for an hour, finding nothing. No signs of a camp.
No gear.
Just the forest, wet and empty. But I know what I saw. Someone was out there, watching, and they knew I was alone. I never liked cabins. Something about being away from everything, deep in the woods where no one could hear you scream, always unsettled me. But my mom loved them. She grew up visiting cabins, hiking, fishing, and spending weekends with her stepsister, Lisa, in places so remote that even a whisper felt too loud. It was my mom's idea to take a weekend trip to a cabin deep in Oregon's forests. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, just the three of us, Mom, Lisa, and me. I had just turned 23, and I would have preferred to stay home, but Mom insisted. Lisa was thrilled. The drive took 6 hours, half of which was spent on winding dirt roads surrounded by towering trees. The deeper we went, the more I realized how truly isolated this place was. There were no houses, no gas stations, and no cell service. The nearest town was over an hour away. By the time we arrived, the sun had already started to set. The cabin was old, small, and looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was worn, the windows dusty, and the air around it smelled like damp earth. Lisa unlocked the door with a key she had, pushing it open with effort. The hinges groaned. Inside, the place was basic. A small living room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. The furniture was outdated, and everything smelled musty. Mom and Lisa seemed comfortable, but I felt on edge. Lisa pointed out that there was a shed behind the cabin, but we didn't bother checking it out. Instead, we unpacked, ate a quick dinner, and decided to turn in early. The forest outside was silent, too silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. That night, I barely slept. The walls were thin, and I could hear every creak, every shuffle. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but I told myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, Mom and Lisa were already making breakfast by the time I got up. Lisa wanted to hike to a small lake she remembered from years ago. I wasn't thrilled, but I went along. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in some spots. As we walked, I noticed something strange. Every few feet, there were small piles of rocks, neatly stacked like tiny towers. I pointed them out, but Lisa brushed it off, saying it was probably from other hikers. But who else would be out here? We reached the lake after about an hour. It was small, still, and surrounded by thick trees. No birds, no ripples in the water, just stillness. It didn't feel right. Lisa and Mom sat on a fallen tree, chatting, while I stood by the water. That's when I noticed something on the opposite shore, something hanging from a tree. It was a deer carcass. It had been skinned, its ribs exposed, its head missing. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. Lisa and Mom saw it too, but instead of freaking out, they just said it was probably hunters. But hunters don't leave animals like that. We hiked back faster than we came. That night, the wind picked up, making the trees groan and shift. The cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. I couldn't shake the image of the deer. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was soft, deliberate. Footsteps. They were slow, moving just outside the cabin, circling it. I held my breath, listening. Whoever it was stopped near my window. I was too afraid to look. Then, I heard something even worse. The doorknob rattled. I lay frozen, my heart pounding. It rattled again, harder this time. And then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Mom and Lisa about the footsteps. Lisa dismissed it, but Mom looked uneasy. She suggested we check out the shed. The shed was small, its wood dark with age. The door was locked, but Lisa found an old key in the cabin. Inside, it smelled of rot. Tools lined the walls, saws, hammers, nails. Everything covered in dust. But in the corner, there was something worse. A sleeping bag. It was old, dirty, and flattened, like someone had been using it for years. Next to it was a pile of empty food cans. Some were rusted, but others looked recent. Someone had been living here. Mom and Lisa looked shaken. We left the shed and locked it behind us. We should have packed up right then. But we didn't. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The wind had stopped, and the forest was silent again. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a noise, one I recognized. The doorknob. I sat up in bed, listening. The knob rattled again, and this time, the door creaked. Someone was inside. I could hear slow, careful footsteps moving through the cabin. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door, and then the door handle turned. I scrambled up, ready to fight, but nothing happened. No one opened the door. The footsteps moved away, out of the cabin. I heard the front door shut softly. I didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, I told Mom and Lisa we had to leave. Lisa didn't argue. Mom didn't ask questions. We packed up in minutes, shoving everything into the car. As Lisa locked up the cabin, I noticed something on the porch. Footprints. Bare, human footprints. Whoever had been out there had no shoes. The drive back felt like it took forever. No one spoke. We didn't stop. When we finally got service, Lisa called the owner of the cabin. She asked if anyone else had been up there recently. The owner said no. The last renters had been 2 years ago, and before that, no one had been on that property for over a decade. We never went back, and I never will. I don't know who was out there. I don't know how long they had been living in that shed. But I do know one thing, whoever they were, they weren't just passing through. They had been watching us, and that last night they had been inside. We were never supposed to leave that cabin. I've spent most of my life working outdoors, construction, logging, and the occasional odd job that takes me deep into the woods. It's the kind of work where you find yourself in places most people will never see, sometimes miles away from the nearest road. I never really thought much about how isolated some of those places were until one fall afternoon in 2014. I had been hired to survey an old logging road in northern Montana. The company that owned the land wanted to reopen it for hauling, but no one had been out there in years. My job was to check for washouts, downed trees, or anything else that would make it unusable. It was a simple enough task. Drive as far as I could, hike the rest, take some notes, and head back before dark. I started early in the morning, driving my truck down a dirt road that had clearly seen better days. The deeper I went, the rougher it got. It wasn't long before I had to park and continue on foot. The trees were thick, the underbrush untouched. The only signs of human activity were the occasional rusted beer can or a long-forgotten piece of equipment left behind by loggers years ago. I walked for hours, marking problem spots on my map, noting where the road had been completely overtaken by nature. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own boots crunching the dirt. I tried not to think about how alone I was. It was mid-afternoon when I first saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump or a rock shaped like a person. But as I got closer, I realized it was neither. A man stood in the distance, just off the path, half hidden behind a tree. He was dressed in old, ragged clothes, his face obscured by the shadow of a hood. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I stopped walking. He didn't react. I wasn't sure what to do. I hadn't passed a single house or campsite for miles. There was no reason anyone should be out here. My first thought was that he was a hunter, but he wasn't carrying a rifle, and his clothes didn't look like hunting gear. Something about him felt wrong. I kept walking, trying to act like I hadn't noticed him. My heart was pounding. I wanted to turn around and head back to my truck, but I was already deep into the woods, and I had a job to finish. I convinced myself that he was probably just some drifter, maybe even a fellow surveyor, though I doubted it. After another hour of walking, I spotted something strange. A cabin. It wasn't on my map, and it looked abandoned. The roof was sagging, the walls covered in moss and grime. The windows were either shattered or missing. It had clearly been there for a long time. I felt an unease settle in my stomach. I hadn't seen any signs of a homestead. No fence posts, no old trails, nothing. There was no reason for this place to be here. And then I noticed something worse. Footprints, fresh ones. They led up to the cabin's door. I stood there, staring, debating whether I should check inside or just leave. Logic told me to turn around, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped onto the porch, the old wood creaking under my weight. The door was slightly ajar. I nudged it open with my boot. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of rotting wood and something else, something metallic. The interior was as decayed as the outside. A broken table sat in the center of the room, an old wood-burning stove in the corner. The walls were lined with shelves, but most were empty or covered in dust. And then I saw it. Pile of bones. Not animal bones. Human. They were scattered across the floor near the far wall, picked clean. Some looked old, brittle, yellowed with age, but among them were fresher ones. My stomach twisted. I stepped back, my boot hitting something solid. I looked down. A knife, a long, rusted blade, crusted with something dark. I didn't need to look closer to know what it was. I turned to leave, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footprints. They weren't leading into the cabin. They were leading out. I wasn't alone. I backed away slowly, scanning the trees, my ears straining for any sound. The forest remained silent, but I could feel it. Someone watching me. I took one step off the porch, then another, and then I saw movement. The man, the same one from before, except this time he wasn't standing still. He was walking toward me, slow, deliberate steps. I ran. I didn't care about the noise, didn't care about my job, didn't care about anything but getting back to my truck. The underbrush tore at my legs, branches whipping across my face, but I kept going. My lungs burned, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw my truck. Relief flooded through me, but I didn't slow down. I yanked open the door, jumped inside, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. The engine roared to life. That's when I made my mistake. I looked up. He was there, standing at the edge of the trees. Close, too close. His hood had fallen back, revealing a gaunt, sunken face. His skin was pale, almost gray, his eyes hollow and dark. He didn't move. He just watched me. I slammed the truck into reverse, tires kicking up dirt as I sped away. I didn't stop, didn't slow down until I was miles away from that place. I never reported what I found. Who would believe me? But sometimes late at night I think about that cabin, about the bones, about the footprints leading out, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too far from the road. I was 19 when my dad asked me to spend a few weeks at his friend's cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. His friend, Mark, was a retired Army sergeant. Tough, no-nonsense, the kind of guy you didn't argue with. I'd met him a handful of times at family barbecues. He had a loud voice, a firm handshake, and a stare that made you feel like you had something to confess. Mark had spent his life in the military, stationed in different parts of the world. But when he retired, he chose complete solitude. His cabin sat about 15 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick forests, rocky hills, and miles of untouched land. He lived there alone, hunting and fishing for food, only coming into town when he needed supplies. Dad told me Mark needed help with a few things: chopping wood, fixing a section of the roof and clearing some fallen trees near the trails. Mark was getting older, and though he would never admit he needed help, Dad insisted I go. I wasn't exactly excited about the idea. 2 weeks in a remote cabin with a retired soldier who woke up at dawn and probably expected me to do the same? Not my idea of a good time, but I went. I drove up on a cool September morning, following a winding dirt road that felt like it stretched forever. Trees closed in on both sides, the only sound being the tires crunching on gravel. I didn't see another car for miles. When I finally reached the cabin, Mark was already outside, chopping wood. He was in his late 50s but built like a man half his age. Broad shoulders, strong arms, no fat on him at all. He barely looked up as I parked. The cabin was simple. A single-story wooden structure with a covered porch, a small shed out back, and a rusted-out truck that looked like it hadn't run in years. Beyond it, the forest stretched endlessly in all directions. The first few days were exactly what I expected: hard work, early mornings, no nonsense. Mark barely talked, and when he did, it was straight to the point. Chop this, carry that, fix this. I followed orders like a soldier, not wanting to piss him off. At night, the quiet was unsettling. I was used to streetlights, distant traffic, the hum of life outside my window. Out here, there was nothing, just the rustling of trees, the occasional howl of a coyote, and the creaking of the old wooden cabin settling into the cold night air. By the 4th day, things started feeling off. Strange happenings. It started with small things. One morning, I woke up to find the cabin door slightly open. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. Mark was already outside by the time I got up, so I assumed maybe he had gone out early and forgot to close it. Later that afternoon, while clearing some brush near the edge of the property, I found something that made my stomach drop. A single footprint in the damp soil. It wasn't Mark's. His boots were large and wide, well worn with deep treads. This print was different, narrower, slightly smaller, but still adult-sized. It was fresh. I didn't say anything to Mark, but I started paying more attention. That night, I woke up to the sound of movement outside. Not animals, something heavier, moving with purpose. I held my breath, listening. The floorboards in the cabin creaked softly under my weight as I moved toward the window. The moon was bright, casting long shadows over the yard. My eyes scanned the trees, the shed, the area near the woodpile. Nothing. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line. My breath caught in my throat. It was too far to make out details, but I knew it wasn't Mark. He was inside, snoring in his chair near the fireplace. This person was just standing there, motionless, watching the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stared, heart pounding, waiting for them to do something. But they didn't. After what felt like an eternity, they turned and disappeared into the trees. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I went outside, pretending everything was normal. Mark didn't seem to notice anything was off. I walked to the spot where I had seen the figure. The grass was pressed down slightly, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I found the knife. It was lying just beyond the woodpile, a hunting knife, its blade rusted but still sharp. The handle was wrapped in old, frayed cloth. It didn't belong to Mark. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here, someone close enough to drop this. I took the knife inside, shoving it deep into my bag. I didn't tell Mark. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want him to think I was weak, or maybe I was scared of his reaction. He didn't seem like the kind of man who took things lightly. That night, I locked the door tight. I kept the knife within reach, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing things, soft footsteps, twigs snapping, distant breathing. And then, around midnight, the doorknob rattled. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was trying to get in. I sat up, gripping the knife. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. The rattling stopped, followed by heavy silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, just as I thought it was over, I heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps moving away from the cabin. Whoever it was, they were still out there. The next morning, I told Mark I had to leave early. He didn't ask why. Maybe he already knew something was wrong. As I packed my things, I saw him standing on the porch, looking toward the trees. His face was unreadable. Before I left, I took one last look at the woods. I saw movement, a flicker of something between the trees, a shadow slipping away. Whoever they were, they weren't done watching. I drove away, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back, and I never went back to that cabin again. It was the kind of cabin you'd expect to find in a remote part of the woods. Located in a thick forest up in the mountains, it was the perfect getaway for someone like me. It was late October, just when the leaves started to turn amber and gold, making the whole place feel like a picture-perfect postcard. I was in my early 30s, and I needed some time away from the daily grind, so I rented this cabin for a few days. The isolation seemed like the ideal escape. The drive up was long, twisting through mountain roads lined with towering trees that almost blocked out the sky. I barely passed any other cars. The sun was setting by the time I arrived, the orange and purple hues stretching across the horizon. The place had no phone signal and no Wi-Fi, which I liked. Just pure peace and quiet. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and looked like it had been there for decades. The front porch creaked when I stepped onto it, and the windows were covered with old, faded curtains. Inside, there were no modern luxuries, just a couple of couches, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Everything about it screamed old-fashioned, like it was frozen in time. I didn't mind. It gave me a feeling of nostalgia, even though I didn't grow up in places like this. The first night went without incident. I made myself dinner, settled by the fire with a book, and watched the flames dance for hours before falling asleep. There were no sounds from outside, just the wind rustling the trees, which made me feel calm and safe. But the next morning things began to feel off. I woke up early, around 6 a.m., to the sound of something. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but this time it wasn't. There was a faint tapping sound, slow, rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking on the cabin. My mind raced. No one should be out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't heard another car pass since I arrived. I got up to check the windows, peeking out from behind the curtains, but all I saw was the dense forest, the fog still hanging low, obscuring the ground. I shook it off. It was probably an animal or maybe the house settling. I went back to bed. The day passed like any other, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The quiet was too quiet, felt unnatural. When I went outside to gather firewood, the woods around the cabin felt eerily still. Normally, a place like this would be full of wildlife sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling, but there was nothing. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. That evening, I made sure to check all the locks on the doors and windows before dark. The tapping sound came again around 7 p.m., the same slow rhythm, almost like it was purposefully waiting for the nightfall. This time, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, thinking maybe an animal had gotten too close to the cabin. But there was nothing, no signs of any animal tracks. The ground around the cabin was hard with frost, and nothing had disturbed it. I went back inside, feeling a little uneasy, but tried to push it aside. I sat by the fire, reading, as the night deepened. Around midnight, I heard something else. This time, it was more than a tap. It was a scrape, a slow, dragging sound that came from somewhere just outside the front door. It was faint, but unmistakable. My heart rate spiked. I turned the flashlight off, trying to listen, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to circle the cabin, the scraping continuing along the walls. I grabbed the fire poker from beside the hearth, a weak attempt at defending myself, though I wasn't sure what I was supposed to defend against. The sound eventually stopped, and the silence returned, but it wasn't the peaceful silence from before. Felt wrong, heavy. The next morning, I was exhausted, barely having slept, but I convinced myself to push through. Maybe it was just the isolation messing with my head. I spent the day walking around the woods, trying to clear my mind, but every time I looked around, it felt like the trees were watching me, closing in. That evening, I decided to leave the cabin for a little while. There was a small trail nearby I'd noticed during my walk, and I figured a short hike would help me clear my thoughts. I made sure to lock the cabin behind me and grabbed my backpack with some water, just in case. The trail seemed peaceful enough at first, winding its way through a dense part of the forest. But the farther I went, the more it felt like the air was getting thicker, harder to breathe. I didn't think much of it at first, but the strange feeling I had started to grow. I reached a point on the trail where it split into two paths. One seemed to lead further up the mountain, and the other seemed to head into an even thicker part of the woods. I took the trail that veered deeper into the forest. It was quiet here, too quiet, and the trees seemed to crowd in around me. After about 20 minutes, I came across something that made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the trail, was a single torn piece of fabric. It looked like it had been shredded. It was too clean, too deliberate. My first thought was that it was part of some kind of animal, but there was no blood, no signs of a struggle. I bent down to take a closer look, and that's when I noticed something else. Footprints. Human footprints. Large, heavy ones, like someone had been walking barefoot through the forest, leaving deep impressions in the dirt. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My stomach twisted in knots. There was no way someone could have walked out here without leaving a trace, and the closest neighbor was miles away. I thought about calling someone for help, but my phone had no signal out here. The thought of heading back to the cabin made me sick to my stomach, but I didn't want to stay in the woods alone with whoever or whatever had left those marks. I hurried back to the cabin, my pace quickening with every step. My thoughts raced. The scraping, the tapping, the strange feeling. It all added up to something I couldn't ignore anymore. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me, but I felt no safer than I had before. Every noise, every creak of the wood made my heart race. I sat by the fire, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again. The tapping. This time it was louder, closer. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I waited, frozen in place, listening to the sound. The scrape followed again, like nails dragging along wood. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my stuff and headed out the door, running through the woods in a panic, unsure if I was running from something real or from the fear inside my head. I ran until I reached the main road, where I finally collapsed on the side, gasping for air. I didn't stop to look back. I knew I had to leave that place, that cabin, behind. I've never gone back. I don't think I ever will. I was 26, not too young, but still feeling invincible. I had a few friends, but I wasn't the type to go out much. The usual weekends were spent indoors, Netflix and takeout, nothing special. So, when my cousin Lucas invited me to spend a weekend in his family's old cabin up in the mountains of Wyoming, I figured it'd be the perfect opportunity to escape the city. The cabin had been in their family for decades. It wasn't much, just a small wooden building tucked away in the woods. The kind of place you only go to if you really wanted to get away from everything. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. I figured it would be a quiet weekend of hiking, reading, maybe some fishing. I packed a bag, grabbed some food, and made the drive up. The mountains were beautiful, as always, the sort of scenery that takes your breath away. The drive up to the cabin was long, 3 hours or so, but the road twisted through some dense forest, and the landscape was mesmerizing. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows through the trees. I parked the car, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The air smelled like pine and something else I couldn't place, almost like damp earth, but clean. The kind of smell that makes you feel alive. The cabin itself was worn, but it had character. The wooden exterior was chipped and weathered by time, but it still held the warmth of old memories. I hadn't been here since I was a kid, but the memories I had of the place were all good. Nothing too creepy, just a peaceful retreat. Lucas wasn't there yet. He had mentioned he'd be coming later, so I wasn't worried about it. I decided to make myself comfortable. The cabin's interior was rustic, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, old furniture. I set my stuff down, lit the fireplace, and settled in with a book. It was peaceful, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of wind outside. That night, the wind picked up. It wasn't unusual for this area, but it was loud. The trees creaked outside, and the old wood of the cabin groaned in response. I lay in bed, unable to sleep at first, listening to the gusts rattling the windows. The sound of the wind was so intense, it almost felt like the cabin was alive. Eventually, I drifted off, though the wind never stopped. The next morning, I woke up to a thick fog that blanketed the surrounding forest. It was strange how quickly it had rolled in. The fog felt oppressive, almost like it was closing in on the cabin. I went outside to take a look around. The air was thick and damp, and the trees were barely visible in the mist. I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. I figured I'd go for a hike to clear my head, so I grabbed my gear and set off, following the narrow trail that led into the woods behind the cabin. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the mud sucking at my steps as I walked deeper into the woods. I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. Too quiet. The birds weren't singing, and the usual sounds of squirrels or other animals were absent. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. After about an hour, I came across an old shack. It was tucked away in a small clearing, almost as if it had been forgotten. It didn't look like anyone had used it in years. Its wooden walls were overgrown with vines, and the roof had collapsed in on itself. I felt an odd chill crawl up my spine as I approached. Something about it didn't sit right. I almost turned back but decided against it. Maybe it was just my imagination. I stepped inside the shack, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. There was nothing inside except dust, old furniture, and cobwebs. But as I moved toward the far corner, something caught my eye, a small, half-buried object. I knelt down and brushed away the dirt. It was an old, rusted knife, the kind that looked like it had been there for a long time. I immediately felt uneasy. There was no telling how long that knife had been there or who had left it. I left the shack quickly, almost feeling like someone, or something, was watching me. The whole experience felt off. The fog had thickened even more, and the trail was harder to follow. When I finally returned to the cabin, Lucas had arrived. He was carrying a cooler and some gear. We exchanged pleasantries, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't tell him about the shack or the knife. I didn't want to seem paranoid. But as the evening drew near, that strange, uneasy feeling in my stomach only grew. That night, the wind picked up again. But this time, there was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. A sound. It was subtle, but it was there. a slow, rhythmic thumping. I thought it was just the wind at first, but it didn't sound like wind. It was too consistent. I tried to ignore it, but it got louder as the night wore on. It almost sounded like something or someone was walking around outside, in the forest just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but the noise didn't stop. It seemed to circle the cabin, growing closer. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking things. But when I peered out the window, the fog was so thick I couldn't see a thing. At around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, the dampness sinking into my clothes. I stood there for a few moments, listening. The thumping was still there, but now it was followed by something else. Scratching like claws on wood. My stomach churned, and the hairs on my neck stood up. I couldn't see anything, but the sense that something was out there, just beyond the trees, was overwhelming. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do, when I saw it, a figure moving through the trees. It was tall, thin, and moving in an unnatural way. It was too dark to make out clearly, but the way it moved, jerky like it was forcing its limbs to work, made my blood run cold. I shone the flashlight in that direction, but the beam flickered and then went out. Panic set in. I rushed back inside, locked the door, and bolted the windows. My heart was racing. I tried to calm down, to tell myself I had imagined it. But the scratching noise continued, just outside the cabin. It went on for hours, stopping only when the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. Lucas seemed unfazed. He made coffee and joked about the creepy noises, saying it was probably just an animal or the wind. But I knew what I saw, or rather what I thought I saw. We spent the day hiking again, but my unease never left. I kept expecting to hear the scratching or see the figure again, but the woods were silent. It wasn't until we were heading back that I noticed something strange. Footprints, clear in the mud. They weren't human and they weren't animal. They were too long, too deliberate. I didn't want to believe it, but I had no explanation for them. As I followed the tracks back toward the cabin, I realized they led to the shack I had found earlier. I knew right then that I had made a mistake. I shouldn't have gone out there, shouldn't have disturbed whatever was in those woods. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the thumping again. It was closer this time, and the scratching too. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. And when morning came, I packed my things quickly, barely waiting for Lucas to wake up. I couldn't leave fast enough. I didn't care if he thought I was being irrational. Whatever was out there, whatever was watching, I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The roads were empty, the fog still lingering in the trees behind me. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something moving in the distance, but there was nothing. I haven't gone back to that cabin since. I don't know what I saw or what it was, but I know one thing for sure: it wasn't something I'll ever forget, and it's something I'll never go back to try and explain.